brief conflict this morning, and so I'll be starting off for her. And just wanted to make sure uh, everyone is on, or if we need to give people another minute or two.
Good morning, Michelle. Thanks for joining our
Hi,
team
Meredith.
here.
How
It's
are
nice to
you?
see you. It's been a
Nice
long
seeing you
time.
too. It sure has. You were
I
at
think we,
DDOT last time we saw each other, I think.
yeah, probably. Um, I think we should wait just a couple more
That's
minutes.
Sal Bernardino. Hello, Sal. Thank you. Hi, Salil. How are you?
I am well.
Good.
Michelle?
I know you're going to be speaking early, so I look
Right. I
forward
believe
to
Opera
hearing.
is going to say a few words.
Yes. Okay.
I think we're probably good to go now.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the Combined Action Team meeting. My name is Michelle Pouchot. I'm here on behalf of Monty Monash from Monash Advisory Group, who is providing the support for the task force and the action team. And so I look forward to being with you today and hearing more about what you do. And I see that you've been meeting for over a year. So I think this is a critical meeting and a critical meeting in terms of meeting your deliverable time frame, which is coming up in a couple months. So today's agenda, we'll do a quick introduction. We'll go over agency roles for protecting basement residents from flooding, infrastructure project prioritization process will be discussed for about a half an hour. Relationship to other district initiatives will be next. And last but certainly not least is next steps and closeout. And so to summarize where the task force is, the task force was established by the city administrator in September of 2021. It reports to the deputy mayor for operations and infrastructure, and DC Water and DOEE are the co-chairs. The kickoff occurred November 17th, 2021. The proceedings of this meeting are open to the public, and hopefully we have some public members on today. All task force and action team meetings are open to the public and are available on the website dcfloodtaskforce.org. The task force schedule includes full task force meetings that occur the third Wednesday of each month, and the next full meeting will be Wednesday, January 18th. The combined action teams have been consolidated because of overlapping issues and that team meets on the second Friday. And previously it was the second Tuesday and the second Friday, and here we are now. The Flood Task Force final report is due in February of next year, and it must have an action plan that includes each of the 9 focus categories. The post-final report, the Flood Task Force members will, post-report, the Flood Task Force members will meet annually to track progress, to go over the action plan, and to continue to discuss budgeting and action item priorities. And so just to recap for anyone who does not know, the 2 action teams in 9 categories are as following. Under residential resilience are 4 items: flood insurance, repairing flood damage, flood proofing, sewer line backups. And then under governance and coordination are the remaining items, including flood infrastructure, regulations and permitting, mapping and modeling, planning and coordination, emergency response. So before we go to the next presentation, I'm told that most of you are familiar with each other, so we don't really need to do a round of introductions. But I do believe that Meredith and maybe one other wanted to speak before Salil gives the presentation.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. And Rachel, would you mind going back to the agenda slide? So I just want to thank everybody for your participation in this task force. It has been a long haul. We have been at this for more than a year now, and we're in our final stretch. Woohoo! Everybody give yourselves a pat on the back. You know, we've got 28 action plans that have been drafted, which is phenomenal. Tremendous amount of work that has been achieved by this group. We have achieved our big goal by bringing multiple agencies together to work on these really critical issues to address flooding. So, you know, we're in the home stretch, finalizing the action plans, getting comments. The core team is working on putting the report together. We'll be able to take a breather soon. We've got 1 more full task force meeting, 1 more action team, well, maybe 1 to 2 more action team meetings. So we can take a breather, but there is still a lot of work to do. Remember, these action plans were just to lay out what we had to do to make things happen. So we don't want to finish the action plans and then just let them sit. We got to keep working. So on today's agenda specifically, we're talking about some items that we still need to keep working on. So we want to keep it fresh in everybody's minds. Protecting basement residents from flooding. We want to make sure, you know, all the groups that have a piece of this and can do something, keep moving on it. Infrastructure projects prioritization. We've got a lot of infrastructure needs, you know, so we're gonna see another way on how to prioritize those and help us prioritize those in the future. So again, thank you. We have done a ton of work. We should all be very proud, but we can't stop working. We have lots of work to continue. So keep it up. And there are lots of outside conversations that have already started and will continue going on insurance and drainage committee, infrastructure, and more. So yeah, just keep the connections going, keep the interagency work going. And thanks. I'll pass it back to you, Michelle.
Thank you. Salil, was there someone that you wanted to have speak before you started?
Yes, ma'am. Apra was going to say a few words. Apra?
Good afternoon, everyone. Actually, Salil, I wasn't going to speak at the introduction. I think that I'll summarize my points, but I echo everything that Meredith has stated. But there's a point in the agenda where we're going to be talking about other things that are happening in the life of the district, other initiatives and programs to which the momentum of the flood task force definitely aligns with. So we'll highlight those a little later in the discussion, but I agree with Meredith, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Opera.
Thank you, Opera. So good seeing you. And again, Monty will be joining later, but I'll be on to keep notes and to make sure she knows everything that's been discussed.
Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, Michelle, appreciate it. Rachel, could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. This is a slide we presented previously. I just want to refresh everybody's minds on what this is about. And let's focus to the far right end of the slide where we talk about occupant/renter. And this is totally based on protecting an occupant who lives in a basement apartment. Now, there was a hurricane up in New York and New Jersey, and we've all heard about it. And there was a loss of life not too far away from here in Montgomery County that did the same thing. When water enters a basement apartment, the occupants of that apartment have very little recourse and no possibility of escaping it. So the best protection for them is to prevent it from happening, or if it does happen, for them not to be in the apartment itself. Now, the potential points of entry of water could be a creek that's overflooded, could be the Potomac, could be one of the feeder streams like Watts Branch, Oxen Run, or it could just be a whole lot of rainfall on the roadway, and each roadway is designed for a certain storm. And if you exceed that storm amount based on the rainfall, and you know, rainfall doesn't happen just equally across the district, you could have a targeted cell in one area that's like 100 or 500-year rainfall, which will overwhelm the system. And that will result in a lot of water running off the streets and potentially entering homes. Next slide, please. So the two options we looked at, one was a building code modification to protect the homes. And second one was a notification, voluntary risk notification, education. And right off the bat, we had thought about the building code modification, as did New York and New Jersey, because they had about 42 fatalities in that area. The issue with building code modifications are a couple of things. A, they are counter for flooding from fire protection. So those recommendations that you would do for flooding are not good for fire protection because the way the door opens, the way the egresses are, and fire as a risk is far more pervasive than basement flooding. The other point is most of the homes are existing that have basement apartments. Any code modifications would be for new constructions. So would not as much impact the current ones. And the cost for retrofit is also very high. Not that we should give it up, but right out of the box, if you want to do something immediately, which we should, there is more return on investment on the education. And the second bullet down here, the public awareness campaigns. As Meredith mentioned early on, this project just doesn't end with this phase. It continues on. And we should continue looking for ways to improve it through building code modifications. But coming out of the box, at the end of this project, immediately, focus should be on education. Rental sales agreements. Make sure there's a notification to renters in the basement to look for weather reports. There's options to communicate with basement renters on how they could voluntarily opt in. There's technology that can be used to notify them of flooding in their area. So all of these solutions that don't necessarily require a basement occupant or a renter or a landlord to spend tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars to upgrade the basements, which would then have a ripple effect, can be implemented immediately. And that's where the focus is going to be, at least the recommendation of the task force. Next slide, please. So these are some of the technology areas which, in addition to the early warning system, we're looking at. This could take a couple of years to implement. HCMA has been a great partner there, along with DDOT, and it's going to take everybody working together to come up with this. So these are some of the intermediate term solutions that are being worked on. I believe that wraps up the abasement, but love to take some questions on this. Thank you. Michelle? Or Rachel, do you want to go on to the next slide to see who's up next? Or we can hold it up there.
So, Leo, can I ask some questions?
Please.
So maybe I missed this on the slides, but who specifically, so like, what are our specific next steps here?
Specific next steps.
Yeah, and who's doing it? Who needs to do what?
So it's
Which
to connect
agencies?
with the folks that do rentals and different agencies, also that give public assistance, and bring them into this discussion and equip them with information that they can send out to the folks that are renting basement apartments. AOBA would also be connected into it. So we just need to connect with all these agencies.
Is DC Water going to continue to be a champion?
We will continue to be
for
a
this
champion.
effort?
We need to find out who is best equipped to, from a DC government perspective, to be able to communicate with them, but we will continue to be a champion because this is a serious issue. It's something we don't see it on every rainfall, that's why we don't think about it, but the consequences are very high.
Yeah, yeah. I'm interested to hear if any others on the call have thoughts about specific agencies or contacts or approaches.
Well, one potential option is this will only get the legal basement units, but anytime you're a landlord and you're like, when you get a certificate, you get a basic business license, and I think it says on there that it's like for a basement apartment or something. So it could be through the Department of Licensing, DLCP, the new one. That could be one way. But maybe there's other ways to get at it. Like, I don't know if, like, for example, if DC Water, if you could like scroll through your addresses, your master address list, and if they have like apartment B or like, something like that in the address, I don't know, that could, I feel like there's lots of different ways you could try and find the people that are living in the basements.
Absolutely. Could be a bill insert and doesn't have to differentiate. Could be one to everybody.
Oh, yeah, that's true too. Yeah.
Because folks might not have a basement apartment, but may know a friend or a neighbor who does.
Right.
Just as another thought, there's also the DC Office of Tenant Advocate. They work with a lot of landlords across the city. And then DC Housing Authority is responsible for anyone that's placed with a voucher. Oftentimes they are the ones attesting and certifying apartment for lease for voucher holders.
Those are great concepts. Thank you.
Nick, what was the acronym you used? Is that can you say
Yes,
that?
DLCP. I don't know what is licensing something. I don't know, but it's when DCRA split into
Department of
DOT.
Licensing and Consumer
Oh
Protection.
yeah, yes. Yeah, that's a great option, because for you to have you do need that typical license, and that's an option. But then another thing that we could do is just some public messaging. And I know that we've talked about that before, is just maybe bringing that to home, just some of the concerns. I know that I share with you all, in addition to New York, but Chicago does have a extensive write-up on basement people that live in basements and things that you should be concerned about. But that's something that we can utilize maybe with the Ready DC initiative our agency administers on behalf of the mayor. And then also do the flood week, just kind of targeting some of our messaging and programming around that.
That's a great idea, Ramesh. Yeah. I was just talking to WTOP about if it's a major storm to just add that as a public service message in there. Major storms.
I think one thing we'll have to keep in mind is, I think there's a lot of, well, certainly the like big broadcasts for like WTOP or like general awareness, like that'll kind of catch everyone, but we have to be careful. In the example I gave of like, if you have a basic business license, that's only catching the people with like the legal basement units. There are probably plenty of illegal basement units in the city. So like, and it might not appear on our, on our registers of who owns property west. We just need to make sure we're also finding those people too.
Right. So the other great source is also houses of worship. The great opportunities for them to also spread the message, because they have the same goal of protecting their folks. So great. Thank you, everybody. We've captured a lot of this in the write-up, but this input is great to keep improving it.
Thank you for Meredith for pushing the Q&A and next step items. I think next we have Nick, who's been speaking. Hi, Nick. How are you? Talking about something that is, as I know from my previous background, the big challenge is how to prioritize the many needs, the already existing decaying infrastructure, and then the layered on top these new environmental challenges that even pose more significant issues. So, Nick, we look forward to hearing from you about this item.
Thank you. You can go to the next slide, and so I'm just going to give like a minute of just kind of intro and context, and then we're going to switch. I'm going to hand it over to an Arcadis team, Katie Duskin and Tyler, to talk a little bit about a project, but I just want to give some context here. So what you're looking at, this is a screenshot of the action plan for developing a list of capital projects. And in this action plan, so this action plan that we have, all of the government agencies part of the task force helped us kind of come up with all of the projects that are flood related that they need to do, now and into the near and long-term future. So we've got this list, but we haven't really prioritized it. And what you see here is I pulled out from the beginning of this action plan. The action plan actually says, the next step is to prioritize these projects based on some agreed upon criteria, geography, cost, timeline, and then and then part B is determine funding sources. But really what I want to talk about today is this prioritize the projects. And if you go to the next slide, just a couple of thoughts here. The first is that for FY24, the budget process that we're going through now, we've already, agencies have already submitted their infrastructure projects that they want, the city to fund going forward. And it's been submitted without a prioritization from the task force. And that's okay. We got this information in as quickly as we could, but I think we're trying to plan for FY25 and beyond so that every year the task force could submit some kind of list that reflects task force priorities and most important infrastructure projects that we could come up with. So we have not, so I want to be super clear, we have not started this prioritization rubric for the task force. However, we have at DOE a separate effort that's related that is looking at a prioritization methodology, and so that's what Katie and Tyler will talk about in a minute. And so we think that methodology may be useful. We're not trying to suggest that the task force should just adopt this wholesale or that we're even ready to like think about it. But I thought the task force action team meeting where we are today might be a good place to kind of introduce some of these concepts and ideas and get some discussion going about based on what you hear, what do you like, what works, what doesn't work, how might you incorporate it, what might you change. So that's what we're going to talk about. So in the next slide, so the project that's separate but related, we call it our resilience focus area strategy. And if you go to the next slide, the reason we are doing this is that in the comp plan, it identifies 10 study areas called resilience focus areas. And so again, this is a comp plan thing, it's in the comp plan, it's published. And the idea is that for each of those resilience focus areas, we call them RFAs, it helps us identify where future planning should be targeted to build resilience. And so the comp plan came up with these 10 areas, and we've been trying to figure out how to prioritize which areas to focus on. And so with that intro, I'm going to pass it to Katie and Tyler to take it from there and describe what you guys have been working on the past couple months.
Great, thank you, Nick. So first of all, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. As Nick mentioned, I'm with Arcadis, and my colleague Tyler Carson is here with me. And we do a couple of different types of work for the district. Just to give a brief intro, we work with HCEMA and Vermesia specifically, providing technical assistance for FEMA grant programs. And then, of course, this work supporting DOEE with this resilience focus area prioritization strategy. So we've been working on this prioritization framework for about 6 months or so. And the first step, if you don't mind going to the next slide, please, is we did some adjustments to the original RFAs. And those adjustments really focused on adding some additional areas to capture all areas of riverine flood risk, and to also split up some of the original RFAs into a more granular level. So one example is what was previously just the whole Southwest waterfront has now been split into Southwest Buzzard Point as number 9 and Navy Yard as number 15. So making some of those adjustments to the RFAs was step 1 to make sure we had kind of the correct areas that we were looking at to make sure that our prioritization was mirroring geographic and flood risk differences in different areas of the district. So that's our list of the final 15 RFAs. And next slide, please. Throughout the last 6 months or so, we have been iterating a prioritization framework. And throughout that iteration, we have been collecting feedback from various sources. This slide is just some examples of feedback we received from one of the Silver Jackets meetings that we participated in and asked for feedback. So as we've been iterating each version of the prioritization framework, we've been incorporating feedback received to help improve the process overall. So on the next slide, this is our current draft framework. And in a second, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Tyler. And as we go through these slides, please post questions in the Q&A, or we'll definitely have some time for Q&A afterwards as well. So this is our current draft framework, and we're currently kind of working on finalizing it. So really looking forward to hearing all of your feedback, and if you think something like this might be useful for the flood task force. So Tyler, I will turn it over to you.
How about now?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Katie. So my name's Tyler Carson. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the details of the analysis that we've done. I'm going to try to keep this at a high level to leave time for questions. So this first slide here is really getting at the first question we were asking ourselves, which are, what are the types of things that we need to consider when we're trying to figure out the prioritization among the resilience focus areas? And so this slide here has we've done a number of iterations based on feedback that we've gotten. And I want to talk through, I think, some of these factors, and then we'll share a little bit more information about the scoring behind this. So the framework itself has three main categories: vulnerable people, vulnerable assets, and actionability. And in addition to the three categories, we're also trying to think around what should the relative weighting of each of these factors be towards this prioritization. And so you'll see underneath of each of the bubbles there a number which represents a score out of 100. So we can see that for vulnerable people and vulnerable assets, we've weighted these equally, both adding up to 45 points each. And then actionability is weighted at 10% of the total score. Within each of these three categories, there's a series of subcategories and metrics that were considered to get to that total score for the category. So within vulnerable people, we see one subcategory for equity that looks at social vulnerability indices, as well as some of the assets for socially vulnerable populations, as well as a subcategory for population that looks at population two different ways in terms of the total as well as the density. Under the category of vulnerable assets, there's also two subcategories: one for flood potential and damages that looks at different flood hazard risks, and one for critical and community assets and their prevalence. And then under the actionability category, there's two subcategories. One that looks at land ownership, what's owned by the district and might be a little bit easier to implement projects on, as well as space availability. Where are there parks or other open areas where projects may be, again, easier to implement?
Question.
So that is, yes.
And it may be in here, critical transportation infrastructure, including the national highway system, emergency escape routes, transit. Is that sort of covered under right-of-way, or is that somewhere else? Is that critical assets?
I think indirectly, it's probably considered through some of the right-of-way areas. More directly, the critical assets under 20 is where...
So the two things obviously critical are transportation, and the other is power. So if you lose power, electric or the ability to have an open escape route, I would think that would be critical. The other question I have is, and I don't know if you've thought about it, but doing this way, which I think is very good, would inevitably lead you to consider what would need to be abandoned if sea level rose versus what would need to be moved. Does that make sense?
Yes, and
Okay.
that's a good point. In the risks that we'll talk about in the next slides, we do look at sea level rise change and areas that might be impacted.
Okay.
That's good feedback. Thank you. So this is overall the categories and information that's being considered as part of this framework to help prioritize, get a sense of the different weights of these here. What we'd like to do on the next slide is the next part of this were to pull out data around these categories to give us some metrics to work from that we could then use to create a score for each of the categories or subcategories. And so what we want to do is demonstrate for a couple of these subcategories how we end up going from the information we think is important to pulling out data on it to translating that to a score. And we'll just show this for, again, one of these subcategories as an example, so you can see the level of analysis that was done. So we're going to highlight here the flood potential and damages subcategory. I'll first direct you to the left side where it says flood risks. As part of figuring out the damages, we were considering 4 risk categories: the FEMA 100-year flood hazard area, FEMA 500-year flood hazard area, the area that's located within what we call blue spots. This is a tool that evaluates surface topography and identifies where you have natural depressions where water can accumulate. And then to the earlier point, we had another category for future tidal inundation, which basically looked at high tide levels, adjusted those for sea level rise, and figured out the areas that were at or below that elevation. And so for each of these 4 flood risks, we basically have potential flood hazard areas. And to identify what the potential damages were, we then started to evaluate the risks in each of those 4 zones. And so we did this.
Question.
Yes, go ahead.
Someone correct me if I'm wrong, the greatest risk to date has been from none of those categories, but from just inadequate sewer capacity. And so the genesis of this task force was flooding that came solely from inadequate sewer capacity in the neighborhoods. And so I'm wondering if that's captured within the 500-year hazard, or if you need to add a 5th category for that.
It is captured within the blue spots category.
Okay, great.
Yes. So what we're seeing typically is where you have those sewer restrictions, those natural depression areas in especially the low-lying parts of the city would be the first ones to fill up. So that is actually intended to get at that flood risk, that blue spot area. Okay, so now that we have the 4 areas, we start to look at the potential for damages. And in the first case here, we were looking at just the area within the right-of-way within each of the 4 risk zones. And obviously, the larger that area is, the more risk that you would have for transportation, for evacuation, and so forth. And so the higher score that you would want to assign. If we go to the next slide, this is how that evaluation looked like. So we had the right-of-way area data in GIS, and we intersected that with each of the 4 risks in order to come up with that area through this exercise. What you're seeing on this slide is layers that represent the area of risk for blue spots, for 100, for 500, and the 2070 tidal condition. So each one of these were overlaid together, and we pulled out the right-of-way area for each to come up with the numbers and generate the scores. Next slide, please. My screen may be frozen, but are we on the next slide?
Yes.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Sorry, I didn't know if I lost you there. Okay, so in a similar manner to figuring out the right-of-way area, we also figured out the total area of building footprint within each of these flood risks. And we did a step further and figured out or parsed that information to give us the area of commercial space, of residential space, and of industrial space. We had 3 categories of buildings that we got the areas for. We assigned each of those their own weighting factor to represent the different costs of damages to those 3 categories. And based on those areas, obviously, the more building area that you have inside risk zones, the higher the score. And so that's how we did that way. On the next slide, we'll see a similar representation of, now we are showing the building footprints and their overlay on each of the 4 risk zones. And again, so we did that GIS spatial intersection here to get at what those areas are. Next slide, please. Okay, so that was the details that we wanted to give for one of the subcategories. Obviously, there are 5 others, and we did a similar analysis for each of those to generate the scores. Overall, for vulnerable people, vulnerable assets, and actionability, and then we could look at the total scores among all 15 RFAs and start to figure out their prioritization. So on the next slides, we're going to show you the visual representation of the results for each category and the overall weighting and scores for the RFAs. So here is the results for the vulnerable populations category. You can see the total scores on the right side of the table to the left. You'll see the resilience focus area name and the ID number. And so these are ranked in order from 1 to 15. On the right side, you'll see the visual representation where darker colors indicate higher vulnerabilities, lower and lighter colors indicate lower vulnerabilities. And you've got subcategories that we've also visualized for equity and population. So a major takeaway here is that based on this, these metrics and the scoring that we've come up with, the top 3 RFAs in terms of the scoring are Oxen Run, the Kenilworth and Watts Branch RFA, and then the Southwest Buzzard Point area. Close behind is Navy Yard as well. And so we can come back to these if there's specific questions, but yeah, the next slide here is now showing the table with the scores and the visualization for vulnerable assets. Again, the subcategories there are the potential flooding and damages and the critical and community assets. So in this case, we also see Southwest and Buzzard Point at the top of this list, followed by the National Mall Federal Triangle and the Navy Yard are all the top 3 in this case. And then moving ahead to actionability, again, visual on the right and table on the left. The top 3 in this case were Oxen Run, Poplar Point, and then the Kenilworth Watts Branch RFA. So we've taken the scores for each of the categories, summed them all up, and now on the following slide, we will show the overall rankings. And here we are. So the table on the left again is rank 1 through 15. And then we're showing the RFA number associated with the first ranked overall, and then in order. So just to how to read this right, where it says overall, RFA number 9 is ranked first. That's the Southwest Buzzard Point RFA. RFA number 3 is ranked number 2. That's the Kenilworth Watts Branch. And RFA number 12 is Oxen Run. That's ranked 3rd. So again, these are the RFAs that we've seen in the previous categories that were at the top of the list. So it's no surprise that overall they're there as well. Again, the visual on the right is just helping to illustrate with the darker colors being higher scores versus the lighter colors being lower scores. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over here back to Katie for next steps and any questions that folks may have.
Yeah, we can certainly go back to some of those slides if people have questions or want to take a closer look. But as we're kind of wrapping up this prioritization framework and the final priorities that Tyler was just showing on the last slide, we're making final adjustments to the framework. And so this is incorporating some final changes based on feedback, one of which is thinking about the age of buildings in each of the RFAs, because as newer buildings are built, the assumption is that they are following new regulations and are more protected against flooding. And so we're going to incorporate building age of generally across the RFAs into the framework as well. And then we're also thinking about all of the planned mitigation projects that this task force is thinking about for the future. So we want to use this RFA as maybe a baseline for thinking about what risk is and what prioritization should be, irregardless of current planned projects. But then we'd like to also kind of almost a second version think about what it would look like with the list of planned projects that are being considered for the future. So we're still thinking about how we want to incorporate that at this point, but that will be brought into the final adjustments. The idea for this long term, as Nick was saying, is that this would be used to prioritize projects for both, policy and funding, specifically for FEMA grants is one funding mechanism that we're looking at in particular. And then we're in the process of starting to write the final report, which will be a living document. So this is something that continued to be iterated on in future years as more data becomes available, such as the integrated flood model, or any changes in risk or projects, things like that. So I will stop there and see if, Nick, you have any closing comments or if we want to go into questions.
Yeah, just a few words. So the next steps you see on here are the next steps specific to the separate project that DOE is doing. It's not next steps for the task force. I think what we're interested in discussing now is, what do we think what was just presented was interesting, useful, something we could learn from for the task force? Is there adjustments we would make? And then just to, if this all sounds like very related to the infrastructure priority list, I mean, it is, and the reason we're doing it at DOE is so that we can pinpoint where, because we only have so many grant applications we can make a year. We want to pinpoint the areas that we should be focusing on, and so this will help us do that. But it's a kind of a different conversation when we're talking about making capital infrastructure project requests to the city, and how do we want to think about that? So I'll stop here, and I'll also just mention that shout out to HCMA for helping us get the funding to do this project with Arcadis. It's another example of task force agencies working together. So I just open it up to thoughts, questions, and so thanks for asking your questions along the way. I think everybody, I think that was useful for everybody. But if you have more, keep it coming.
Well, from my perspective, this is the missing link. This is what has been missing in this task force process, and you have to have this kind of framework in order to prioritize projects. I mean, from my perspective, this leads to an overall strategy for flood resilience for the district, where you decide what gets priority and therefore resources, and that serves as a filter for your projects. So when they come up, because if this is an urgent matter, it's not business unusual, and you can't just look at each agency's project and let them fund it and implement it on their own schedule. There has to be, a citywide framework that determines what gets priority. And I think this kind of tool is mandatory. I don't think you can have it without something like this.
Thanks, Sal. I see. It sounds like Opera agrees, so that's good.
Yeah, thank you, Sal, for those comments. That's really great and important. My takeaways from this, and this is actually the first time I've seen this presentation presented. One, I think the great news is the top 3 areas are our primary focus areas already. Southwest Buzzard Point, Watts Branch, and Oxen Run. That's where we've got projects that we are starting, design projects we're trying to kick off, focusing money and our grant applications towards. So that's good that we've, the work we're already doing matches up with how this prioritization was done. Yeah, and I want to second Sel's comments that I think when we started this, we started trying to put a prioritization, measurement method in here and using different categories, but we couldn't, we just didn't have the time and availability to focus on how to measure those things and how to do the mapping. So I think this is really great how it, can take the different information we have on populations and buildings, putting it all together, putting all these different layers together. I think we can definitely take this and use it further, because this does just focus on the coastal and the riverine areas. We know that the interior areas, there are a lot more interior areas to look at. We don't have those mapped yet to know. But yeah, I think this could be very useful. So thank you, Katie and Tyler.
Yeah,
Hey,
maybe
this is
one.
Melissa.
Oh, go ahead.
I'll echo a lot of what was said. The one thing that this brought up for me is how, as we start doing projects and we start focusing in on some of these priority areas, we then translate this to measuring whether we're making the impact and shifting, so that the top priority neighborhoods no longer have to be. And I'm not quite sure that the framework as it is actually really allows you to do that, because so much of it is based off of demographics and geography. And so I just would challenge us to kind of think a little bit longer term about how we are measuring our progress and telling the story of reaching some of those successes.
One thing you have to get to at some point, and I know this seems far off when you look at the forecast, but at some point there has to be a plan for what gets abandoned when sea level rises and what gets moved. And that's critical, as I said, for power and transportation infrastructure. And you can't wait until 40 years from now to start thinking about it, because it's such a long lead time to move a highway or move a rail line or move underground electrical facilities. So at some point, that someone has to start looking at that.
One thought on Melissa's comments. I don't know if you were thinking more than this, but in theory, yeah, especially when we have the maps from our integrated flood model online. So right now these maps use like a really coarse, what we call blue spot analysis, which is trying to figure out like just geographically where the poor drainage areas are. But with the integrated flood model, we'll have like a pretty scientific map of where the interior flood risk is. And I could imagine, so like let's say we implement a blue-green infrastructure project in a neighborhood. When we run the model again, that neighborhood will not have the flood risk because this project's been implemented. And so then that project wouldn't be, it wouldn't have that like flood hazard score that it would before. So I think from a mapping perspective, we could probably get there pretty easily. I think the hard part, and maybe this is where is more what you were saying, is like, if part of this is going out to residents and like doing the soft things to make them more resilient, like awareness and all that, like is that being accounted for? That one's tricky.
Yeah, and I don't think that this ranking necessarily has to be the same way that we're measuring progress. I just think we need to start thinking about that so we can tell this.
Well, it's good. It's a good it's a good government thing to do, right? Like if we're going to spend money, let's make sure we're we're getting the results we want out of it. So.
Very quickly, Nick, there was a question in the chat from Victor. It was building type considered in the prioritization? We know building type can be a physical limitation that determines which buildings can be mitigated. Example, elevating a building or utilities. Some communities have more buildings with these physical limitations than others.
You know, we, as Katie mentioned, we are trying to do another iteration of this where we're considering building type from more of the perspective of like, was it built before regs, after 1985, or like before the recent construction code update? But this is an interesting angle that maybe we'll talk more with you after.
Yeah, we did include building type when we considered the potential for flood damages. So recognizing that a residential building versus commercial versus industrial does have different potential for flood damages during the flood event. So we did incorporate it in that sense. And like Nick said, we're working on adding in building age. We did not include it in terms of it. I guess what you're asking is in that actionability category, like does the building type within each RFA impact our ability to do mitigation actions? And we didn't incorporate that level of detail at this time.
Yeah, this is Victor. Thanks, Katie, for that. And yeah, definitely recognize you're saying that you looked at the residential and versus commercial. One thing that I would add is that when we like so regionally, when and I think you may know about this, when jurisdictions drill down into the residential types, they're finding that residential row homes, people who own and live in residential row homes, are very challenged with meeting the existing compliance standards. And even if given funding to retrofit those type of structures, there's some challenges with that. And so because that is such a significant barrier, I was just wondering how that was being captured in the prioritization, because we know a lot of our east of the river communities have just such an abundance of that type of residential type.
So you're saying that those areas should be raised in the prioritization?
Well, I mean,
Is that the challenges that they're
I wouldn't say
facing?
that. I'm just talking about, considering that as a factor and letting the model, uh, produce the results as it will. But, I think that is a significant factor to consider when you're looking at structure type. So obviously, you pointed out the difference, that you looked at residential versus commercial, but within residential, in the floodplain world, we are finding a significant, and there's a lot of literature on this out of New York City's Office of Planning. We're finding a significant sort of hurdle with actually getting that housing type to comply and meet, some of the standards, even when funding is given. And then there are, consequences behind when that type of house, that row home, actually is mitigated. There's significant changes to it. So, there's a whole story behind that. But I think it is certainly worth adding that in as a factor. Yeah,
Yeah, Victor,
because when
that's
you look at the spread of housing types across Southwest, Ward 7 or Ward 7 Watts Branch and Ward 8 Oxen Run, and you look at the housing type through the lens, or you look at those areas through the lens of housing types, you see large multifamily residential in some areas. That it might be public housing. You also see single family homes, but you also see row homes, and they all present different challenges, some easier than others, to actually mitigate. So there are physical limitations that each type brings that should be considered, and it's already an ongoing conversation regionally. So I don't think we want to miss that.
Yeah, and if I could point to that within the actionability portion, maybe it's more so like the techniques that could be utilized in those particular areas that once we do have the prioritization, and let's, Watts Branch is one of those tops, but as Victor is sharing, there's different techniques, maybe like New York, they looked at their land use and their coding as a technique as far as showcasing some of the potential options for the homeowners to take, because they could not do elevations or some of those retrofits that are seen as best practices. But a technique would be right now is I understand New York is doing is like public awareness, understanding that risk, and potentially moving most vulnerable things outside of your basement, and potentially elevating your utilities to a higher ground. So like looking at techniques that could be used to that what techniques may be most useful for that particular RFA.
Yeah, I think that's a good suggestion for Misa and Victor. Okay, well, I think.
Yeah, I'm looking at the time.
Yeah, well,
I think
I'll
we've
I'll
had a
kind of
good,
I'll close
robust
this out.
discussion.
I'll close this out. We can move on to opera, but so it sounds like we all think this is a good direction to head in, and I'll just add that I think there is another layer that we're going to have to think about for the flood task force. So what you're looking at here, this is just prioritization of areas. It gets a little bit more nuanced if you think about prioritization of projects, because every project, you might have a small dollar project that's only going to affect 10 houses, or a bigger project that's going to affect 100 houses, and thinking about the cost difference and the number of people, and then the amount of risk that is being reduced. So it's another layer that we'll have to think about, but certainly seems worthwhile. And I guess we will I guess continue. I don't know how we're gonna. There'll probably be, I guess, a few optional meetings to kind of iron that out over the next couple months. Do that. So stay tuned. We'll keep the action team members posted about how we're trying to move forward and get your input. But thanks very much, Katie and Tyler, for sharing what you guys are doing for our other projects.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
That was a great discussion. The next item is about relationship to other district initiatives. And Opera, are you up on this one?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Ms. Michelle.
You're welcome. And I saw in the chat, you mentioned that, there might need to be some additional work sessions after getting this, the really robust presentation that we just received, and then layering that against all of the projects and initiatives that everyone on this call is involved in. So hopefully we'll hear a little bit about that in this part of your presentation. Thanks, Opera.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon again, everyone. So the next portion of our discussion really is to kind of actually tie in a lot of what we've already been discussing and alluding to Meredith's opening remarks, and how to keep the momentum and the priorities of the task force top of mind, not only just as agencies and stakeholders working together, but as a district priority. Mr. Still actually alluded to something that actually should be first mentioned on here, which was the 2012 Mayor's Task Force on Flooding, which was really prevention in the Bloomingdale and LaJoy Park area. But As you look through the report that came out of that task force that was in 2012, there have been some significant strides on a short, medium, and long-term basis. Long-term, thinking about the Northeast Boundary Tunnel, which is going into commission next year. And then some of the short-term things that were discussed, such as the backwater valves program and green infrastructure and catch basins. So it's obvious that as a district, there has been some significant strides when it comes to flooding specifically. But what we would like to do in this next iteration of the kind of citywide task force is to make sure that we are keeping the same momentum on things that have been discussed over a decade ago, but as well as kind of aligning them to the things and the future of the district for the next 10, 15, 20 years plus. So I'll just start by also saying that back in this time last year, actually, the DC Council held a resiliency forum and roundtable. It was the Committee on the Transportation of Environment. And really what they looked at was to discuss efforts that were underway to prepare the district and where possible mitigate the effects of climate change. And that included flooding. So this was an area and all the records are found, of course, on the DC Council website. But during this discussion, it was very much discussed that there needed to be kind of this overall hands-on deck action plan of flood mitigation and risk, specifically for areas that have been historically underserved, which is every time that we talk as a full task force or as action committees, that is something that's always brought to the forefront, is not only how are we mitigating climate risk specific to flooding, but making sure that that mitigation and the urgency of that goes towards vulnerable populations that have been suffering for this for years to come. So the DC Council definitely does have an inference and a focus on that when it comes to what we're doing as a flood task force. I will say that as a task force, we have not reported and provided information and updates to the council on what we're doing in the task force, but we have discussed how to introduce the work that we've been doing in a kind of a more formal, informative setting with all council members. And we're thinking that that might be more appropriate towards council period 25 or the next council period. As Meredith alluded to, we are getting ready to finalize the report. And so, of course, that report would have to be going to the city administrator first, but we would hope to share that with council and make sure that it's atop of their minds, because as you know, council goes through a rigorous budgeting cycle. So it would just make sense to the work that we're doing, it would be aligned with the overall budget and what's being proposed there. I'll also say that the Build Back Better Infrastructure Task Force, so this was something that was initiated earlier this year with the announcement of federal dollars in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So what happened was that the mayor got organization stakeholders together to talk about how the district was going to prioritize and which projects were going to be prioritized with the funding that the district is supposed to receive through the BIL. It's been reported that the district is going to receive in the upward amount of $3 billion just through that funding. So we have been meeting as a task force. DC Water sits on that task force, as well as some of the other utilities, and there's a host of other outside experts. The subcommittees for that task force are transportation, innovation, technology innovation, workforce capacity, and environmental and resilience, administration and compliance and procurement. So what we're in the process of doing now is highlighting projects within those subcategories that should receive expedited funding, or not expedited funding, but funding as it relates to the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Which is great that we're talking about prioritization within this task force, because I think that once we're able to get to a place, to Mr. Seal's point, of really talking about what gets priority, therefore it gets funding, it's just easy to send the playbook of, okay, this is what the task force has identified, we've been working on, and these are the areas specific to flooding that we think should be advanced through additional funding efforts. Next slide. There was also, there have been a host of environmental briefings with the city administrator. The reason why I think that this is important is because it's important for everyone, our stakeholders and the task force to motivate ourselves to let people know that this really is a priority for district leaders, right? And so the city administrator has been hosting a series of environmental meetings and briefings, really to hear and understand the landscape and future planning efforts and forecasted needs on district-wide initiatives to meet a host of resiliency and sustainability efforts. We just had the second of the slew of briefings to be held. And in that second briefing, we definitely talked about this task force and what we've been doing as far as flood planning and mitigation. And the city administrator, as well as the other stakeholders in the room, were very interested on kind of what's top priority, what's really needed right now, what are the funding gaps, and what could be done in order to get us to a place or get us to a point of resolution. So I do think that once we submit the report, like I said, it's going to be submitted to the city administrator. There's a great room and opportunity to have our ongoing discussions and make sure that we put a plan in place that is supported through resources, particularly with funding at the highest level of government that we have here in the district. And then what I'll finally close and state and say and bring back home is that the city just launched, I'm sorry, next slide, what is called the draft racial equity plan. And so it's actually been through this long process. The Office of Racial Equity was actually something that was a part of legislation that was in the REACH Act. That was legislated last, I want to say, winter of probably 2020. So out of that, there were a host of different initiatives and outcomes that the district would specifically be looking at as it relates to addressing systematic discrepancies and misplacement of communities within the District of Columbia. And so as of this month, the Office of Racial Equity launched what is coined the DC Draft Racial Equity Action Plan. And so the purpose of this plan is to talk about significant areas of focus, which there are, I believe there are 6 indicators between or proposed equity indicators within the draft plan. So they go from housing to economic opportunity, health and safety and education, neighborhood life, and civic engagement, of which there are things within the task force, the action plan of the task force, that directly tie into this draft racial equity plan, specifically under the areas of housing, economic opportunity, and neighborhood life. And so with the draft plan, it's to go to the council and the mayor for adoption, but there's going to be different projects and again, funding, right, that gets streamlined and accelerated through the work of the racial equity plan to make sure that we are addressing, as I stated in the beginning, kind of the urgency of our most vulnerable communities and populations in the work that we do. So this was kind of just again, a quick overall look. The life of the district is something that is always moving and busy. I believe that everything, I am not a native Washingtonian, I'm here from Houston, Texas, but I do believe that what happens in the district sets the tone for the rest of the world. And so it has been exciting to see and hear and understand all of the different things that are happening. And while we're not quite where we need to be, we are definitely on a path, and this task force has just been able to elevate the conversation, who's in the room, and the needs. And so again, I echo the sentiments of all of my task force colleagues when we say that the work does not stop here, and actually it's just getting started, because now as it's rising to the priority of other institutions and other conversations, there's vehicles at which we are able to get to a real means and a real, hopefully, resilient and sustainable DC. So that's all I have. I do not know who's next, but I'm also here for questions.
Thanks, Opera. Meredith, I think I'm calling on you and Nicholas
Yeah, I'll
for
take
next
this one.
steps. Okay.
Yeah, so we're wrapping up the meeting here. Just a couple of reminders. So on December 29th, the public comment period for batch 3 is closing. So that means, we've sent a bunch of emails out to our stakeholders and members of the public that have shown interest in the task force. And so hopefully we will get some comments from that group. And then when we get comments on the 29th, if your agency is kind of a lead agency, you'll have like a week and a half to make those changes, and then submit them back to us so that we can give it to all of the full task force members in time before they vote for final approval. So yeah, Rachel's been there's 3 slides of this just to remind everybody what is in batch 3. It's our biggest batch. But yeah, so no particular action right now for action team members, but come the new year, hopefully there'll be a few comments, and you'll need to revise your plans accordingly so that we can incorporate and then give it to the task force. So yeah, and then upcoming meetings, January 13th. That'll be the action team meeting, and then January 18th is our last full task force meeting, and then shortly after that, we'll be. I think we have to submit the final report to the. It goes through the government chain up to the CA, so it's going to take at least a month or so. So that'll probably be submitted around this time in January, and then we need to publish it in February. So I think that's it. If anyone else from the task force team, did I miss anything? Anything else we want to add?
I would just say, please stay, keep a lookout over the holidays for small group meetings in order to advance the follow-up information needed based on the good input we received today. I also want to say, kind of personally, it is really encouraging seeing that the collaboration across government, and that is key to finding a way to implement these most important projects across the board that impact all of the individual agencies' budgets, but in the end become the most important projects for we, the citizens of the District of Columbia. Are there any other comments or questions before we close out? Any from any public members that might be on board? Well, with that, I would like to again extend apologies from Monty Monash, who was really got tied up today, but hopefully I came close to being a substitute for her. Thank you for receiving me nicely today, and you all will receive follow-up information from the task force. And I give you back 10 minutes of your day. Thank you for calling in.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Michelle,
Good
for
seeing
being our
everybody.
meeting today.
Thank you.